everyone, welcome back to my channel. If it is your first time here, I am Anastasia Mealy, a watercolor artist from Australia, and I'm glad you have found me. A few weeks ago, I posted a video where I talked about finding growth in my watercolor practice and what helped me on that journey. So that video was all about the shift in my creative mindset, and this video is going to be all about the technical skills, techniques, and also practical knowledge of watercolor that I think have been the most helpful to me. First of all, I would like to thank you all for your beautiful comments on that first video. I'm so glad that so many of you found it useful, and I love sharing all things watercolor in this space, so there will definitely be more videos like this one, so stay tuned. Also, I have been thinking about maybe making a watercolor/creative process Q&A video over the next few months. So if you have any questions for me, let me know. Now let's do a very quick recap of part 1 in case you haven't watched it. So I returned to painting in watercolor around 7 years ago, and it was the first time in my adult life that I was finally able to spend more time and effort on learning this beautiful medium. I already had a rather solid foundation as I took art classes when I was a teenager, and then I also painted and did some drawing a little bit here and there throughout my life. But I still felt like a complete beginner when I came back to my painting practice back in 2019. And the biggest growth in my skills has happened in the last 7 years. I do not have an art degree, and I consider myself largely self-taught. I learned by reading books on watercolor, researching things online, but mostly by simply painting a lot and almost daily. So I'm mainly a landscape painter, so whatever I'm going to tell you here is relevant to that subject. But I believe it would still be perfectly applicable to all the other subjects, such as still life, portraits, abstracts, whatever you're interested in, and so on. So without further ado, let's get into those technical skills. Probably the most important thing that has helped me improve my work was understanding the role of tonal value contrast for creating landscapes I was happy with. So when I look at my earlier work, at my earlier paintings, they generally lack stronger darks, and they have way too many midtones. Watercolor is known for its lightness, for its luminosity, but you cannot really paint the light without adding deep darks to a scene. Even the lightest, most transparent, airy scene would need a tiny amount of deep shadows somewhere for the light to emerge. As this contrast between the lights and the darks is what makes a painting sing. I would quite often finish a painting feeling like it was still lacking something, so I would reach for my black ink pen and add a few hints of dark tones here and there, and then this would transform the scene, or at least improve it quite a bit. So technically, that painting would then become a line and wash piece, which is a separate discipline, which I also love and enjoy, especially for my sketchbook work. But I wanted to create purely watercolor work without relying on the use of black ink. Interestingly enough, I was perfectly aware of how much difference a strong tonal value contrast can make in my photography. I remember when I first got my digital camera, like in the early 2000s, most of the photos that camera took looked really flat. So I learned what levels and curves in Photoshop were, where you could boost the darks and the lights if needed. And then I saw the huge difference this would make to a photo, because it would have much more visual impact. But somehow, when I returned to my painting practice, it took me a very long time to actually figure out that the same principle would apply to my paintings as well. That in order to create a strong visual interest and a strong balanced composition, I need to employ a stronger contrast between the whites and the darks, and especially around the focal point area, as strong tonal value contrast helps hold the viewer's attention there. So I started mixing my own darks using colors like sepia, burnt umber, indigo, pearland green, Payne's gray. And I would also use these colors much more boldly than I used to. And this really helped me transform my work. I do want to mention one thing though. When we start our watercolor journey, we often buy student quality paint, but that paint has less pigment, which is the actual color. And it also has more fillers that would often make the wash quite chalky and opaque. So it would be harder to mix really strong darks with student quality paints compared to artist quality paints. And I would highly recommend, if it's possible, to invest in professional quality tube paint right from the start. It is my opinion that high quality paint and not the 100% cotton high quality paper is what makes the biggest difference when it comes to watercolor materials. And I would rather have just a handful of high quality colors than a large set of, say, 24 student quality colors, as this allows you to create strong but still luminous darks, as professional paint has more pigment and it is also more transparent in my experience. And if you want to create a strong tonal value contrast in the painting, you also need to keep your lights airy and bright. And using transparent colors helps with that, as the white of the paper that glows from beneath those transparent washes helps create that luminosity that watercolors are famous for. Now, I'm a huge fan of Thomas W. Schaller. One of the biggest things that I learned from just looking at his work is how powerful strong darks are in watercolor. So I have this book I got for Christmas a few years ago, which I treasure. And if you look at these stunning paintings, you will notice that this artist is not afraid to use really dark, almost like black tones in his work. And whenever I pick up this book or I see his work here on YouTube or online, I always feel very inspired by his use of the tonal value contrast. Now, the next thing that has helped me find growth was finally figuring out how color theory worked. So despite all those classes I took when I was younger, I had a very limited understanding of color theory and color relationships. I, of course, knew the very basics, like for example, if we take a blue and a red, they would make purple. But I wasn't really aware of the way complementary colors affected each other when mixed together or when they're placed next to each other. Plus, I wasn't paying much attention to color temperature, like how cool or warm a color was, and also the importance of color temperature when mixing primaries. Like, say, when we're mixing greens and we want to use yellows and blues, but how warm or how cool those yellows and blues are, it would affect how vibrant or how dull the green would be. I remember looking at other people's work and wondering how they would come up with such beautiful soft greens, or let's say complex purple, or desaturated moody blues, or interesting browns. And I had no idea how to mix neutrals really as well. And I think one of the most groundbreaking moments, sounds very dramatic, but it truly was when I heard that adding a touch of a complementary color would reduce the intensity of another color. I think I was listening to a podcast where and the artist who was being interviewed, they talked about their use of complementary, how, for example, to reduce the vibrancy of the color red, to push it into the distance and to create that atmospheric perspective, they would add a touch of green to that red, because green is a complementary color to red. So adding it to red would make it less vibrant. And this was a very cool discovery for me, and I love using complementary colors now to create rich, complex neutrals, or also to reduce the intensity of a very vibrant color. So one of my favorite books on color theory, and I have talked about this book on this channel already, and I will talk about it again, is The Art of the Limited Palette by Hazel Sohn. I have a few other books, but this one is just written in such a clear way. Plus, I love her work. Plus, my understanding of color temperature finally clicked when I got this book. I highly recommend it to any watercolorist. I would also highly recommend having a color wheel on your desk. If you don't have like this one, there are online color wheels. You can, like websites with color wheels that you can access. I will not be going into the details of how color theory works here because this video is not about that. But there are so many resources available that go into great detail about color relationships, color schemes, and also how to use color in your work to create a harmonious look. And I feel it's actually crucial for every beginner artist to educate themselves on the topic. I know that when I finally grasped the core of color theory, I was able to create work that felt more like me, to use colors that I'm drawn to, and also how to mix those colors. Also, if you look at my palette, you will see how unlimited it is. And I often use many of these colors in a single painting, and I'm still able, in my opinion, to create color harmony in my work. And I actually absolutely adore having a lot of color in a painting. And I love it when artists combine a lot of vibrant colors in a scene as well, because it just brings me so much joy. I'm also generally very fascinated with the way color with the power that color has over us and how it can affect us, how it can affect our moods, our living spaces, and so on. And I think we artists are just so lucky that we get to play with colors and choose the ones that bring us joy and make our life brighter. The next thing I want to talk about is water. One of my most favorite things in watercolor painting is watching the colors mix on paper and create these beautiful color transitions, or also interesting textures and granulation effects. So painting wet on wet and using a lot of water is my favorite technique in watercolor painting. I think when we pick up watercolor, we do not always understand how this works, and also it can actually feel a bit scary. So we tend to use either not enough water or not enough paint. So we do not offer enough freedom to our watercolor to move, to flow, to dance. And the work may end up looking like a page in a coloring in book. And I certainly had this issue early on. I was always way too timid with the amount of water used. And I feel my paintings from back then were not expressive enough. They were not reflecting the playful nature of watercolor. So there is this widespread belief that watercolors are hard to control. And I really do not like this saying. I actually do not want to control my paints. I want them to flow. And I believe that they open up and they show us what fun effects they can create only when there is enough water on the surface. I prefer to use the word guide instead of the word control when it comes to watercolors. I let them be free and I guide them if needed. I actually feel that watercolors are much more cooperative when we're not trying to control them. They are very free-spirited. They just want to play, they want to be free, and it's one of the countless reasons I love them so much. So once I started being braver with them, when I started creating very wet washes and just dropping a lot of thick paints into those wet washes, it was when I really found my feet. And I learned how watercolors behave on paper by watching them flow faster in a very wet wash, slower when the wash is beginning to dry, and then how you can also create really fun textures when adding water to a semi-dry wash. So, talking about the well-known term water control, I learned it by letting go of that control, if that makes sense. Plus, I think it's a very fun and joyful way to make art. Plus, it creates this element of the unknown, this intrigue even, as we do not really know exactly how the wash would turn out until it dries. And I love this, and I think this is actually one of the driving forces of my painting process. The next thing I want to mention is edges, soft and hard edges, also known as lost and found edges. I have a video on edges and I will link it in the description. In that video, I explain my use of edges on an example of a simple landscape. So I will not be going into a lot of detail on the edges here, but I want to say that using the play between the soft edges and the more defined edges is one of the most powerful ways to create a strong composition that is very engaging for the viewer. So harder edges around the focal points would catch the viewer's gaze and make them slow down and spend more time looking at the important part of the composition. And softer edges will gently guide them around the scene, and softer edges are also wonderful for creating cohesion within the scene. You can connect multiple elements of the scene using softer edges, and this will bring more harmony to your landscapes. So early on, most of the edges I created in my work were quite hard, and the landscapes lacked that mystery, that intrigue. All the elements of the landscapes that I painted, they looked like little cutouts pasted next to each other. But when I started paying attention to the edges, especially softer edges, and making sure that I have a variety of them in a scene, that's when I actually started noticing great improvements in my work. Another thing that I found very helpful for improving my skills was moving away from painting from photos. So I relied on photos as a reference for a long time, and I pretty much always ended up very disappointed with those paintings, as they looked so very sad compared to the photo reference, as I was simply trying to copy the photo, and I didn't have enough skill to make that painting look like the reference photo I was using. It was still a very valuable experience. I do believe every single thing we do in our creative practice teaches us a lot, as we find out what works and what doesn't simply by trying everything. So I was tired of feeling disappointed every time by my painting results, but using those photos actually helped me create like a vocabulary of things like clouds, rocks, trees, mountains, boats, and so on, that I was able to paint then from memory without looking at the reference. And then I started creating simple scenes using those shapes, those elements of the landscape, which ended up being great fun, much more fun than sitting in front of a bad copy of a photograph. So instead of copying the shape of a tree from a photo, I was creating my own tree, and so on. And also, because I wasn't constantly jumping between the photo and the painting, I was able to focus on what's happening on the paper in front of me. I was paying more attention to the tonal values, the color scheme. I was actually able to create more harmonious color schemes, and so my compositions also became stronger. And it was actually fascinating how fast my skills started improving once I stopped painting from a reference. Then sometime later, I actually came back to using photos. And I do use them on a regular basis these days, as painting without a reference actually taught me how to use photos in a better way. I do not try to copy them. I simply borrow the complex shapes. I do not really know how to paint without reference, or where to place the objects in that composition. Or I also create smaller sketches using a photo, and then I would rely on that sketch as a reference for the rest of the painting process, which helps me focus on the tonal values, the color harmony, etc., without me being constantly distracted by how photographically accurate it looks compared to the photo that I was referring to. One thing I want to say though is that I have always used my own photos as a reference for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't have to worry about copyright. Second, I want to paint something that I have seen with my own eyes, something that's meaningful to me, because when I pressed that shutter button, I did it because I was moved by what I saw. So my photos are loaded with the emotion I experienced in that moment. And photography is a huge part of my creative life, and I love how I have that creative discipline to capture the things as they are, how they look in real life, And then in my painting practice, creating photographic likeness is not my goal, because so for a long time I had this belief that realism is what I needed to strive for in my art making, but that belief is long gone now, thankfully, thanks to my watercolors and what they taught me. Another thing, getting to know my materials very well was also rather helpful in building my technical skills. Watercolors have different characteristics like opacity, staining, granulation, light fastness. There are single pigment colors and there are multiple pigment colors, which are also known as convenience mixes. Watercolor paper is made of different materials like cotton or cellulose. It also comes in different finishes like cold press, rough, smooth, and paints act differently on all these different surfaces. And when it comes to brushes, we have a plethora of different natural and synthetics brushes of all shapes and sizes for all kinds of brush marks. So figuring out how the materials I was using were affecting my painting really helped me get better results, as I learned that, for example, to get luminous darks, I needed to know which darker colors on my palette were the most transparent, and that softer brushes with a long belly helped me create more playful, more expressive marks on paper. And that some pigments fade when they're exposed to sunlight, which is not ideal when you want to display or sell your work, and so on and so forth. And lastly, the most important thing that helped me grow was simply painting a lot, pretty much daily. Doing something consistently inevitably leads to growth, to better skills, to a more effortless, more enjoyable painting process. And just 10-15 minutes of playing with your paints a day will make a huge difference over, say, a year or 6 months even. It's like anything really. Learning something new always takes practice, and we just need to stay curious, open-minded, consistent, and kind to ourselves, like we would treat a child learning to, say, ride a bike, encouraging them and supporting them. So I think this is everything I have to say for now about the technical skills, about the technical side of things. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments. I hope your creativity is flowing freely, and if not, like it has been, to be perfectly honest, for me lately. But it's okay, it's just the ebb and flow of the creative process. I hope your muse returns soon. Thank you for watching and happy painting.